Welcome to episode 96 of the XRM Toolcast. In this episode, Scott and I speak with Carsten Groth about newly generally available Power Platform pipelines. Carsten has recently written some excellent blog articles about Power Platform pipelines, both from the perspective of the Power Platform admin as well as from app makers. So if you're interested in learning anything about Power Platform pipelines, then this is definitely the episode for you. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of the XRM Toolcast. With me, your host, Daryl, always raising the bar, and Scott, sad that it's not St. Patrick's Day anymore, but Daryl, Scott, how's it going?
Very good, thank you, Daryl. Yes, goodness me. Well, it was my sister-in-law's birthday on St. Patrick's Day, so yeah, we kind of went to the pub, but they didn't have Guinness, so it was it was a bit of it. But they had some local stout, which was good. But yeah, I'm going to Dublin for the European Power Platform conference, actually. So looking forward to doing the
almost
Guinness
like going
factory.
back home.
And yeah, exactly. It's going to be flying over things. It'll be a bit weird, but I've a bit out of breath actually because I've been chasing a woodpecker off my roof. So I mean, this whole woodpecker thing is new to me because you didn't get woodpeckers in the UK,
right.
but and like having wood houses is quite concerning with the woodpecker. So I don't know if it's like they have the possibility of like putting a hole in my house. Anyway, I've been out like crack of dawn with like waving a broom like a mad person, but they're really loud. Like I mean, it kind of sounded like someone sort of drilling a pipeline near me. Mm-hmm. So and talking of pipelines,
wow, Scott, that was amazing. That was amazing.
This came to me while I was waving the broom.
I can't even speak with a normal voice. Oh, wow. Yes, speaking of pipelines.
Yeah.
Our guest today has written some excellent blogs on the brand new Power Platform pipelines. His name is Carsten Groth. He's a Global Blackbelt EMEA, Senior Technical Specialist at Microsoft DE, been an MVP since 2012, now an RMVP. And he considers all of his opinions to be tentative. So, Carsten, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Carsten.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, great to be on this. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, application lifecycle management, pipelines, not only those, Scott, you mentioned, also the software pipelines
Yes.
are quite in my lifetime all day long. And are kind of natural gut feeling, part of my DNA, if you will, dealing with all these XRM, previously CRM, now Power Platform and Dynamics 365, and obviously around the solutioning area. Yes.
Just quickly, what does a global black belt do? I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds like in my mind, I've kind of got this impression of sort of, you sort of swinging in through windows and like kind of doing all of these fixing everyone's issues and then sort of stealthily accessing.
Absolutely, it's kind of the Supermans, if you go in this tradition of Dynamics Con, for instance, we are these kind of superheroes coming in with our industry knowledge and basically helping out our enterprise customers as well as smaller customers in terms of understanding the architecture behind all these kind of things and gluing things together. So it's really about cross knowledge that we bring into this and helping customers to really find their architectural ways to deal with these platforms. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what kind of color black. I wouldn't be black belt. I mean, I probably maybe kind of pink polka dots belt. I think I probably would be something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky we don't need to actually wear a black belt, right? So that's at least something, even though we have it in the title. But it's really around these kind of, it feels like coming in. Sometimes even I'm throwing Lego bricks in front of my customers and say, hey, this is me, right? Start building.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. But it's, ALM and pipelines, and it just seems to be a real focus point of them with like managed pipelines, and we'll talk about that. Sorry, managed environments, and we'll talk about that obviously in a minute. But it seems to be like such a hot topic. I mean, there was governance, obviously, was a big deal, kind of for the last couple of years. But then recently, ALM and pipelines and DevOps has suddenly become this big focus. Why do you think it suddenly just popped out as becoming like at the top of everyone's radar?
I think it's part of the nature of companies thinking about the compliance governance of all these artifacts being created. I mean, think of these enterprise customers starting in the default environment, thinking about personal productivity, and then all of a sudden someone throws in now something which is AI related, for instance. And this big or large AI model obviously shakes up someone who is maybe a little bit afraid of, hey, are we losing something? Are we passing something to an artificial intelligence which we are not really having under control, you know? And I think around these kind of building artifacts, it recently became more public even for citizen developers to understand, hey, we no longer just have the default environment as our playground. We do have multiple other environments and also personal development environments. And then this new idea of fusion team development came up, you know, which is not in general a new idea, and it's not Microsoft who came up with fusion development, right? But for me in person, and I started my career being a software developer, right? So I started with HTML, CSS. I came over into the JavaScript world, then TypeScript. Actually, you were the one, Scott, who brought me into TypeScript, by the way. So learning all these kind of things, and then putting all these kind of things together and making it really easy is something that the team behind Power Platform Pipelines really had in mind.
So how long have they been generally available? Let's start with that.
So Pipelines has been available or generally available since March, right? It's fresh, hot off the press, if you will.
It's a brand new baby.
And we've been dealing with all these kind of things for quite a while now, right? So it has been around in private preview. It has been around in terms of thinking around what's the vision? How can we make it actually an easy, composable approach, easy to learn approach for anyone who wants to deal with this typical 3 layers of application lifecycle management. And by 3 layers or 3 tiers, I'm considering development, test or Q&A, and then the production environment.
Awesome. And what all does this encompass? Does it encompass everything on the Power Platform? Is it just more focused on Dataverse? Give us a whole spiel of what are people using this for?
Yeah, so in general, the whole solution has been built on top of Dataverse. So it's using Power Platform in its own and the Power Platform capabilities to make things easier for any kind of development. And there were 3 roles actually that came into mind. The first is obviously an administrator. So someone who sets up these pipelines, someone who is basically in responsibility of the pipeline's host environment and setting up all these kind of definitions in terms of which path to follow, right? Then the second role was around, okay, what are we going to do with our pro developers or code first developers? Because, I mean, pro developers, who in the citizen developer world is not a pro, right? So let's call them code first developers for a while, right? And they should also be able to deal with this new in-application experience. So that was the second role. And then obviously it was the third role, which is the unknown or maybe the hidden champion that we need to equip with something or a tool set which is so easy to understand that they don't need to learn anything about ALM beside A, L, and M, right? And that's all they need to understand. As simple as this, 3 easy steps to consider in terms of how to develop something, take it into a queue or testing environment, and then further push it or pull it into the production environment.
So we've got the pipeline that, as you say, has this 3-stage deployment, starting with development, starting with your unmanaged solution that you're putting all the stuff into that box and working on it. Run us through what might be the typical cycle of who would set up what. What do you see people doing? So if someone was starting out a new project, for example, and someone had, some makers had started working on a new app, and they needed to get that into production. What's the sort of the cycle of getting from that point to the point where actually it's moved into production?
Yeah, and that is, for instance, something which needs to be carefully considered, right? We now have these new switches, which basically allows an administrator to toggle them on, which means that any kind of Canvas application, for instance, or flow becomes natural part of the default solutioning, or the default solution of this specific environment. Well, first of all, me being a maker or a citizen developer, I don't understand what a solution is, right? What's that? I'm not used to this, right? So per se, it's a definition to educate any kind of makers of what a container is, or a solution as a container is. And then it's about them understanding that any kind of artifact them creating, it's the objection to basically identify those kind of artifacts over the whole course of a lifetime of these artifacts. And I think this is also something where makers sometimes struggle, right? Because makers immediately have an idea and they start thinking about, how can I bring this idea alive? So what's the first take? You open up a studio, whether it's Power App Studio, whether it's Power Automate Studio, whether it's even Power Virtual Agents, doesn't matter. Any kind of artifact, you go into the creator's experience and you start creating. And that was worrying the administrators if this is already done in the right environment. And as you know, there is this environment picker, which you all have in your studio. Well, guess what? The nature of this picker is it reminds the last environment which I was into. So if I was into default environment, the next time I'm jumping into this, I'm developing something in the default environment. But what happened if, for instance, I got a call by an IT pro, which basically said to me, hey, we have to inspect something in your developer environment, X, Y, Z. So I jump into this from the environment picker, and then next time I'm going into the studio, immediately starting creating my artifacts, and boom, I'm in the wrong environment. So that's number one, I'm in the wrong environment. Second is, I could be out of a solution container, right? And being out of this zone is something very inconvenient if you consider that this artifact you are creating is somewhat business critical.
So it's almost like before you even get to that starting point of the pipeline, you have to address that challenge of signposting people into the right place to start creating those artifacts. And like you say, that the container, I like the word container because solution is somewhat of an abstract term to somebody. Whereas actually, if you say, well, actually, I'm building all these different things and I'm putting them into a container, then I think that probably is an analogy that makes a lot of sense to people. So how do you generally recommend people addressing that problem? How do you generally recommend signposting so they make things in the right place and they don't end up with new underscore, or it's not actually new underscore. It's not new, is it? It's now CR04B.
It could be anything, right? Anything which is considered to be your prefix. And also this is, for instance, something, I mean, consider me being a maker, and all of a sudden I get a publisher prefix. What's that? What the heck is that, right? What is a publisher first? And then why did someone decided not to take CGR, for instance, for me? So my first initials, and then the two from my last name, right? And instead go with something crazy, something like car, for instance, right? And then I'm like, why the heck did I became car _, right? And this reminds me well of the things that we had in the past, right? When we came from this XRM world and we considered how are all three of us, for instance, work on a single solution. So how as a fusion team can we come together, but still we are able to understand who built what, right? And these kind of things, I tend to explain them to my customers really by bringing in, for instance, a Lego blocks. And why is that? Because I have the box, right? I do have the package container. Then I have the loose bricks in there, which is the artifacts that we are playing around with. And then I do have the manual, which is the recipe. So someone basically is starting to say, hey, you should build up this like this, or that like this, you know? And this really helps in terms of understanding and onboarding makers. And obviously behind all these objectives that we had, or that the team had designing pipelines, was making it as easy as possible for makers to onboard. And for instance, when I was running through this, Daryl, you mentioned my blog page, where I was basically, stepping into the shoes of each one of these roles. And I haven't yet published the last role, which is obviously me being a professional developer or code first developer and using pipelines, right? This is upcoming. But I have already posted my takes on the admin view side as well as on the maker side. And on the maker side, I think there's one critical item, and that is don't shut down the ideation. Because if you break any kind of ideation, you're typically losing the maker's world, right? Because as a maker, I would say, what the heck did my admin team came up with? So I feel blocked. So I search for something else.
Foster creativity. Don't want to close creativity down. You know, that's the whole point of it. And it's like Absolutely. Lego is like your analogy with Lego is brilliant because it does. It's all about creativity. But on the other side, on the flip side, I mean, when my kids were into Lego, it was all about the default environment is like the living room. Whereas, you know, the environment I'm trying to steer them into is like putting it back in the box so they don't have Lego all over the place I'm going to step on. But assuming that they do have, assuming you've got to that point where you know, it's not hard, it's not an easy thing to do, but assuming you've managed to get them in the right place, and you're not, like you say, you've not closed down that creativity. You're getting people to have that ideation and make apps in the right place. Assuming that's all working, what's the selling point for pipelines? So if our listener hasn't really ever heard about pipelines and they're only at the moment they're just exporting solutions, or maybe they're even using, I don't know, Azure DevOps or GitHub to do their ALM with solutions. What's the elevator pitch, if you like, for managed pipelines?
And I'm glad you're asking, because sometimes people say, why the heck is that in-app experience now? Because we do have Azure DevOps, we do have GitHub, we do have ALM Accelerator, we do have the manual export-import functionality. So why on earth did Microsoft now came up with Power Platform pipelines? And I think the elevator pitch goes as quick as this. For makers, it is to make the transport convenient and an easy example or an easy step-by-step approach, which also reduces the amount of friction incoming by noisy error messages. Because on all the other, on all the other approaches that I mentioned, you recognize that there are very intense error notifications sometimes popping up, right? And even code-first developers sometimes struggle to say, what's that error message? It says something about dependency on blah, 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 blah. I don't understand. Where the heck is this dependency coming from? And now step into the shoes of a maker. And a maker creating something in a merged or shared environment. And all of a sudden, they, for instance, attaching a table which was created by somebody else. And then a dependency is in there. And that dependency, for instance, blocks the solutioning to be transferred into a QA and obviously into production later on. And what the team behind the Power Platform pipelines really had in mind was to make this a smooth and easy experience, which also means take out these noisy error messaging, which says there's an error number, there's a text that somebody can't understand, and really make it as simple as possible. So if there's a dependency violation, call it out as being a dependency violation, as simple as this. So it's like, for instance, following the Lego manual, right? And all of a sudden you picked up the brick, which doesn't have the 3 dots on it. You picked up the brick which had the 4 dots on it, right? And it's easy as this. This is everything where a maker should feel comfortable about and say, oh, yeah, I did make a mistake. So let's go back to my design board experience, if you will. Let's fix this error. And if I can't fix it, I do have my Fusion team counterpart who possibly is able to help me with this. And this is what we had in mind from a maker's experience, right? And you can imagine, and me being ongoing with solutions for, I think it's more than 15 years now, that I'm doing solutioning with, starting from CRM 1.2 all the way down to the cloud editions. So you can imagine that there's a lot of dependencies that I created in my career, and a lot of other stuff where, for instance, you called out just the metadata, but you forgot to add something else in terms of this, and then you were surprised because your solution couldn't be imported into somebody else's environment.
So let's go through that example real quick. So let's say we have someone that's created a Dataverse table, and for simplicity reasons, it's sitting in dev, hasn't been pushed to any other environment. A maker comes in, references that table. We happen to get lucky; they happen to be in a solution, same publisher and everything else, but and they're also in the correct environment. And then they go to push that to the next environment, and that's through the experience of the pipeline, right? So they go in the pipeline, they say, I'm going to go to the next environment. So the error message they see then is, hey, you have a dependency on this table, and that needs to be either included or you need to move that solution, or what are the details of that? How does it help them?
Yeah, it helps them in terms of exactly like you described it. It throws an error message which says there is a dependency on a table which is missed, or it's not only about the tables, right? It will throw an error message which basically says, hey, you missed an artifact, right? And that is basically like, again, if you compare it to the Lego brick system, and somebody built it, then crashed it, put it back into the package, and deployed it to their sibling, for instance. Well, and Scott, you already mentioned it. On the floor, there is this one tiny little piece that you forgot to put back into the package. So is your sibling able to build up this artifact again? No, because this simple artifact or this simple building brick is missed, right? And this is exactly where Power Platform pipelines helps makers to understand this complexity which is behind solutioning, without them learning solutioning from ground up. And those who have been learning these kind of things or who followed the learning path around solutioning, you know that there's a lot of stuff ongoing, solution layering. How on earth should a maker understand what solution layering is, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other day I tried to explain it, like there's a canvas, and on top of that canvas you have another color, and then you do have another color. And then even if your image or your picture is ready that you have painted, the other day you decided to use it as a new blank page, if you will, or a new blank canvas, and recreate something else, right? Or like a tattoo that you get rid of and say, I need to cover that tattoo with something else, right? And that's really complex for makers. And I think it shouldn't be like this. Right.
It's a hugely complex area when you start to look at the design of how you build in dependencies and things like that. But by the sounds of it, the pipelines are trying to make make all of those kind of concepts a lot simpler, so that people don't even start to think about those. They just try and think about it as simply a container that you're moving between environments. So it seems to be that by taking this managed pipeline approach, you're saying that, well, hey, the vehicle for moving between environments is this container, and that's the only container, rather than saying having this kind of complicated set of, different dependencies and segmenting. It seems to be aimed to much more of a single solution deployment. Would you say that's a good differentiator?
It's definitely like this, right? And yes, there are some boundaries, specifically if you deal with this first version, right? And possibly those who have seen the block announcement, there's a lot of stuff upcoming for this. And personally, when I went, for instance, into my experience from a maker side, I said, oh, there's room for this improvement, absolutely, because I need this action right now. The beauty of it, I think, is that it has been built with the help of Power Platform. So it's becoming Power Platform, which will help to implement all these kind of things. Like, for instance, me as the maker, I'm stepping over this notification or error message, which says something about dependency. So where do I turn next, right? Do I understand the error message and say, okay, yes, you missed this tiny little Lego brick that is sitting there on the floor and somebody barefoot can step onto this? No, definitely not. It's more around that you can hook in, for instance, with a Power Automate, and this Power Automate or even the virtual agent bot could pick up on this and say, hey, here is your counterpart, or here is your colleague who knows about solution layering, who knows about dependencies, and this colleague now can help you, right? And then immediately you collaborate on these kind of things. And as I said, it helps makers to fully understand what they are doing, right? And this, what they are doing, is also in terms of the responsibility, because sometimes, as I said earlier, we see something starting as a small idea, right? A really small personal productivity idea. Someone steps into your office, or someone you are giving an introduction to this flow, for instance, says, wow, that looks awesome, amazing. Can you share it with me? Yeah. And then it's shared with yours, for instance, Scott. And then afterwards, you show it to Daryl. Daryl says, wow, can you share it with me? No. It's not me who can share it because I'm not the co-owner, but I can ask Carsten who can share it with yours, right? And then we come 3. And then with this small group that we are, another group steps into our room and says, wow, that looks phenomenal, awesome. Can we have this artifact, And all of a sudden you do have a business critical motion. And this business critical motion, I think this is very important, that makers do understand when this point in time is a given, because they also need to have, I would say, they need to have a model in terms of the supportiveness of this artifact, right? So is it then me, for instance, supporting this flow any longer? Or can I step over into my IT team and say, hey, can you please now do the first-party support for these kind of things. And if you drill into all of this, you figure out this is solutioning, right?
Yeah.
This is all around the solution containers, and it starts with an environment where there's one single container in there, which is the default solution. And even this default solution is not fully understood by administrators, for instance, right? I still have customers who say, why the heck does this default solution, and sometimes it's even in environments, it's even called CDS default solution. What's CDS, right?
I know, it's still there. It's never going to leave. We're never going to get rid of CDS.
yeah, absolutely. So the good old days, if you will, right? And then you have to explain, hey, this is an evolution which is continuously improving around these kind of things. And it started with the common data service in 1.0 and then went over to the next wave.
So we've got our environment where we've got this container where all the makers are collaborating and putting things in. We've got the Fusion dev team. And then we've got two more environments. So we've got maybe a test environment, and then we've got a production environment. So it seems to be what you're describing is the growing up of a solution from that first stage of the ideation, as you describe it, to growing up to being much more of a managed solution deployment into production, so that you're somewhat isolating it away from that place where people may be changing things and maybe moving stuff around, a little bit more fragile, brittle, and like you say, handing it over to someone who is going to then manage it in a little bit more of a controlled way. And so that handover is that move from the development container into the test container. And what I liked about it is the fact that when you start to create a pipeline for your solution, it automatically handles that export and then import downstream. So perhaps you could just sort of run through, what actually happens after you've created a pipeline.
Yeah, so when I was basically jumping into this administrator shoes and I set this up, everything that you need to do is strictly follow the documentation as it is outlined. And that was the very first time I said, wow, that's a smooth documentation written. Because sometimes we do have documentations where someone says, you now need to jump into Azure. You need to create a service principal. What the heck is this, right? And this installation of Power Platform pipelines is really a smooth thing running. And it's as easy then to come up with these 3 stages of a pipeline. And once you created this, it's even easier to share it with makers so that any maker can obviously use the pipelines. And the beauty of it is exactly like you described it. So first of all, you are setting up the environments. You're doing this by basically providing the environment goods and setting them up as either being the production environment, being the test or QA environment, or being the personal developers environments. Once you have done this and all these check marks are basically validated, which is also something which is built in. There's some nice little validation tests which are done for yours in terms of if these environments qualify for being part of Power Platform. Once you've done this, you can already start to build up your pipeline. And your pipeline can then be as simple as say, hey, my first stage is move to test or to Q&A. So you're simply providing the environment. What is my developer environment? What is the test or Q&A environment? And then from that on, you extend this model to say, okay, next is I need to set up something which is move to production, which says, okay, I'm now providing the development environment and I'm providing the production environment. But here's the tricky part in it. You're also providing the previous step, which says, no, the first step is that it needs to be deployed to a test or QA environment first before going out to production. So no one can basically bypass this test Q&A stuff. which is pretty important. Sometimes, as we have seen, there is some artifacts being built by makers who really should be tested, stress tested, you know. I'm not saying that the logic itself is being wrong, but I've seen so many Power Automate flows, for instance, that could have been optimized in terms of the API calls amount or requests, for instance, or in terms of the logic. And I just stepped over this when I personally was walking through the experience of Azure OpenAI services, where I need to avoid this apply to each thing in Power Automate, right? So I wanted to get rid of this. Well, is this something which feels natural to makers? Not firsthand, I would say, right? And then in the end of the day, if it now turns back into the pipeline experience, it's a very smooth in-app experience for the makers, because you see a screen which tells me the first step is to deploy it to my test environment. And the other button which says deploy to production isn't yet active, right? So it's shown inactive unless I've done the first step. And then there's this beauty which happens behind the scenes, which is turning your artifacts into a composed, managed container, which is this solution container. And that managed artifact is actually stored inside Dataverse afterwards. So anyone can download these kind of zip files, unpack them, and then really figure out these kind of things. And I think this is also a nice little feature that maybe only those very familiar with application lifecycle management will recognize, because you can download this managed zip file automatically with the help of Power Automate. So how easy is that, right? I do have Dataverse. I do have a Dataverse trigger which says anytime there's a new file being created, download it automatically and put it up into a file space, for instance, or put it directly as an upload into my Azure DevOps repo. And that is, for instance, something where I closed the feedback loop, because that was my first intention, where I said I wanted to have this managed container or this managed file afterwards in my Azure DevOps repo.
So if you were doing it manually today, so if there's someone who's manually exporting that solution and then importing it to the downstream environments, and they're using that dialogue that sets up the connection references and the different environment variables and things like that, how would that experience work in this particular pipeline that you've just described?
Yeah, and that is another feature which we have or which can be achieved or can be seen inside Power Platform pipelines, where there's this nice little wizard, which analyzes the artifacts being built. It recognizes, for instance, that you do have connection references in there, or connections sometimes even just in there. And it also recognizes when there are environment variables in there. And that extends the wizard or the dialogue being shown to the makers and say, hey, first of all, I found connection references. So are you sure that you want to use the same connection referent endpoints, for instance, inside the test environment, or do you want to switch them? And this is the beauty, for instance, when it shines with business applications, right? So if you, for instance, developed something and inside the development environment, I used a developer SharePoint list, for instance. It doesn't contain too many records, but it's just for development purposes. And then you have inside the test environment, you do have test data. So you need to switch this SharePoint list URL from A to B. And this is magically asked for in this wizard, right? And then the next part is around, like I said, which kind of connection is going to be used, because you might change this connection from being a connectivity of a service account A, and inside test or production, you want to become this a service account B, for instance. And this beautiness, right? Yeah.
Is that done at the actual, when you're defining the pipeline, or is that done for each app you're actually trying to deploy through the pipeline that you're having to go
It's
through and make those
actually
decisions?
done for anything single application that you deploy and run through the pipeline, because the solution completely gets analyzed behind the scenes. And this is often sometimes where people have asked me, because firsthand, if you see it for I would say for 30 seconds, it just shows 2 stages in there. But then all of a sudden, this wizard or this wizard dialog extends and say, okay, now I can find connection references and I can also find environment variables. So why is that? This is because behind the scenes, the complete solution container gets wrapped inside this managed solution. And by doing this, there's some cross checks ongoing, which is also something makers are normally not familiar of, which is a solution called Solution Checker, right? Yeah. And Solution Checker is something that code-first developers are very familiar with because they are running pretty much any artifact through Solution Checkers first to find dependencies, fight dependencies, if you will, right? But also ensure that there's no other error messages. And this inspection, which is magically run behind the scenes for yours, extends the wizard dialog and pops up these kind of information and says, hey, I found these kind of things. Do you want to switch them when you move things out?
And that's done on the initial run through, or is that done every single time you want to go from dev to QA?
It's every single time. So once you do it into test, it asks for doing it for the test. And if you do it to production, it asks for the production experience as well.
Which is basically the same as if you were going to do it manual, but what you've got is a much slicker user experience there, right?
Is it more posh, Scott?
It's something that is enabling you to clearly see which version is in which environment and having a much more controlled export and then import into those environments. But you would still need to have, as the person running that deployment, you would have to be the person who's creating those connections and authenticating against those connections in the same way as if you were going to manually do it, which is somewhat different if you were doing it through, an ALM, a DevOps pipeline where you might use a service principal or something like that. So it seems to me it's quite a nice middle ground between that manual doing it in a very uncontrolled, exporting it and squirreling away your zip file somewhere. Like you say, Carsten, where it actually stores it in Dataverse. So you've got that as a reference rather than just losing it in someone's local download file versus the kind of the full-blown accelerator or a custom DevOps pipeline.
Yeah, or just consider it, like you said, I mean, there is this manual import-export stuff, but makers I've seen using this were very confused the first time using it, because when you click on export, the very first question you get asked is unmanaged or managed. What's that?
Are we going to have that conversation now? Are we doing this?
and we shouldn't. Absolutely, we shouldn't.
You've got no choice because it's managed only, right? That's the only. So you can only do it managed.
Yeah, and I think again, this is the beauty where pipelines shines, because there are some pre-selections made for you, right? So you are kind of on an autopilot, which says, for instance, when you're deploying something into the test environment, you will see that you can manipulate the version number, right? So it allows you to basically increase the version number, but it also does it already automatically for you, right? So some pre-decision, some kind of magic autopilot is ongoing. And this is also something where I think we could spend hours on in terms of explaining makers of how these versioning number actually occurs. What's the pattern behind this, right? So why on earth is it 4 times or these 4 things? So major, minor, what's that, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, if you then, assuming that you have a qualified Q&A test, for instance, or a validation success on all these kind of things, When you then deploy it into production, you're no longer able to manipulate the version number, which is a true help in terms of that this version is now taking from the master branch, if you will, right? And I'm talking now really on the ALM specifics. So if you take it from the master and then really pull it into the production line as this qualified production release, if you will. And this is something where I think in general, it's not only very helpful for makers, it's also a very interesting thing for code-first developers to use it. They might not like the UI experience, right? Because as code-first developers, you're used to Visual Studio, you're used to Power Platform CLI, and using those kind of things. But the beauty is there is a connection between Power Platform CLI and pipelines.
You're making it sound like if it's not text, I'm not going to like it, and that's not the case.
But it is like Carsten said, you can use pipelines, so you can actually do it from the command line as well, which is so actually is pretty awesome from that perspective, and it just makes it super easy just to then deploy, just from that command line, So don't give me no stinky user interface. I just want a black and white black and white terminal connection.
Yeah, and I love, for instance, that the team designing it behind the scenes not just had the makers in mind, they also had code-first developers in mind and said, we want to make this life really easier. And we know that it's been a long story and a long conversation that we have with the product engineering team behind this in terms of how was the solutioning designed, why there is unmanaged versus managed, why there is a layering in terms of solutions happening, when do dependencies occur and when not, right? How to avoid these kind of things. So there have been many discussions in the past in terms of making the lives easier. And if you consider what's the general goal of application lifecycle management, I mean, the general goal of application lifecycle management is not to make someone's life more complex. It is about making it as smooth as possible to consider if anything goes wrong, here's my repository, and first of all, I can go back to the previous version, which is pretty important in terms of ensuring, for instance, that the business process can continue to work while I'm fixing the errors. And then in terms of fixing the errors, I can immediately return to the point of where I started from and say, okay, let's now go into the inspection mode. And I think this is pretty important, like I said, when we consider these multiple roles in Fusion development teams coming together. Because in the end of the day, and that is something that I see happening just recently, which is that makers started approaching the Power Platform by realizing or by creating their own ideas. That was the first thing. But then it came into a movement. So people came in for hackathons, for instance, and they said, wow, we can all work on this single idea. And that means, for instance, you, Daryl, you keep track of our theming, right? You keep care of all the screens, for instance, that we are using inside
Don't
Canvas.
Give theming, Daryl theming. Don't. I mean,
I knew it was a bad idea, but I wasn't going to say anything about it, Scott.
If there's one thing I've learned working with Daryl, self-confess though, right, Daryl? I mean,
I do not make things pretty. That's for sure.
we get Christine to do that, right?
We can get Christine for that. Absolutely, that would be helpful afterwards. And again, this is a nice little thing, right? What happens if the three of us, if we have created individual artifacts, those artifacts are now glued together as a single solution, and then we are already proud of our child, right? So we would push it out to production and say, here it is. And then someone like Christine jumps onto and say, from a UI UX perspective, here's an optimization for this. And how convenient would it be if we can hand out our created artifacts as a solution container to someone like Christine and say, beautify it, go for it.
And having that reproducibility of getting from that dev environment into the test and production, I think is huge for me. I think that from an ALM perspective, that if anyone was to ask me, why should I do something in a controlled ALM, semi-automated way, it would always be about, once you've done it first, like you say, Carsten, how do you then do it again with reducing the risk? How do you make sure that you can keep on making those iterative improvements and changes, but without having to constantly go back to, okay, how are we going to get this into production? And how are we going to make sure we do it in the same way as we did it last time, so it's not going to break production? And that is the single reason, I think, that the feeling of confidence that gives you is huge.
Yeah, or consider another scenario that I heard quite often, where customers ask me, like, what happens if X, Y, Z is leaving the company? And this person has been creating such beauty artifacts, but all of them are business critical. So we discussed in the past, like, okay, how on earth is it possible to reassign the ownership of the artifacts, right? But consider it that someone says, hey, here's an application that someone created, but then this working student, for instance, is no longer with us, and you want to improve this version, this release, to the next release and make it the next production line thing. And I think this is the beautiness of ALM, right? I don't need to start from scratch again. I do have my repository. I can go into this. Hopefully, I can find some commenting inside the lines of code as well, which would help me to really speed up in terms of this. But lucky us, we now have AI and all these AI co-pilots for us, which can quickly analyze what's ongoing behind code, right? And that again, I think this speed in terms of the time to value, time to market that you generate with this approach of following the ALM side of the house, this is something where you can spend hours to either teach it to makers who are not familiar with application lifecycle management, or you make it as easy as pipelines, which is, here's 3 single steps. And that's why I said, you just have to remember A, L, and M, 3 easy steps.
So if people wanted to try this out, what's the best way of people kind of getting so that they can actually see what this does and see how they can deploy their solutions?
Yeah, the quickest way is really a fast setup in terms of using one of the Office 365 developer accounts, for instance, and attach to these developer accounts the Power Platform or Power Apps developer plan. And why is that? Because we just recently announced that you can now spin up to 3 environments into this. And they also qualify to be enabled for being managed environments, which is a pre-qualification or prerequisite to basically work with Power Platform pipelines. And even though the documentation says you need, or there should be a need for 4 different environments, you can still work with 3 environments. And this is the fastest way of basically getting familiar with all these Power Platform pipelines capabilities.
So we're quickly running out of time, but I want to make sure I get this one point here. When they say, hey, you need a managed solution, and they go in their solutions and my solutions aren't, environment, managed environment, and they go in, they say, oh, my environment isn't managed. What happens if they make it managed? What does that do to them?
So basically what it tells you is that you set up the environment to become on an autopilot in terms of the admin side behind the scenes, which makes things way more convenient. For instance, that in general, the administrator of all your environments receives a weekly digest of what's ongoing in all these environments. And that is happening once you turn these managed environments on and you have these toggle things ongoing, right? There are some things in terms of if you consider it later on to be used inside your production field or your production environment, then obviously there are some commercials with that coming as well. So take a look into the documentation, what it means. And we also have this nice little wrap-up table which says where or in which kind of environment you need standalone licensing compared to where you don't need them, right? And in a real world, for instance, I just came out of a conversation like this where a customer was asking that. And I said, the only really environment in production later on where you need to have standalone licenses for is your production environments. So the test, the Q&A could be sandboxes. The developers can be equipped with the developer plan licenses. And yes, if you consider that, it means that, for instance, in a company where you have 300 developers, you can have 900 potential developer environments in there. So you need to come up with a good environment strategy, right? Do you really want to give each and individual developer these 3 environments, or do you want to make them work into shared developer environments? But that's a topic for the next time, maybe.
That is
talking about
the next time, yes.
The environment strategy.
Developer environments, yes. Carsten, thank you so much for joining us and walking through the sweet spot, I would say, for a vast majority of clients, because a vast majority of users of this aren't huge corporations, right? I mean, there are a lot of them, number-wise, you probably have 500 that are 20 employees, and then you got like 10 that are at 1,000, right? Or more. So I think this applies to a large percentage of the user base out there that maybe have 1 person, 2 people that are kind of working on this stuff in the background. And yeah, they don't want to learn everything that I've had to learn about solutions and XRM and all that kind of stuff to do that. So yeah, these managed, the pipelines here definitely makes a lot of sense. So appreciate you sharing with us, and we will share links to your blogs. It's very helpful on the subject. And if there is any other questions that our users may have, how can they get a hold of you?
So the easiest way is obviously following up with the contact information on my blog site, but you can reach out with my Twitter handle, which is Carsten_Groth in this case. So I added the W, and this is due to the beauty that I had a colleague which say, hey, you're always growth mindset. So why on earth don't you make the joke with your last name and put a W in there? That's how I came to this.
Awesome. Well, Scott, that's how our listeners can get a hold of our guests. How can they get a hold of us?
Yes, Daryl. So you can email us at cast@xrmtoolbox.com, or you can get us on Twitter and LinkedIn at xrmtoolcast. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And thanks very much, Carsten. It's been fantastic talking to you again. And I really hope that we can all meet up face to face very soon at a conference. So yeah, thank you ever so much.
Absolutely. Looking forward. See you in Dublin.
Yes, absolutely.
Enjoy. Bye, guys.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been the XRM Toolcast with Daryl and Scott Durrell, produced by Lynn Zawin. If you have any questions or suggestions, please send them to cast@xrmtoolbox.com, tweet @XRM Toolcast, or hit us up on our LinkedIn XRM Toolcast page.